It is curious that in our incessant quest to understand the human condition, we have dedicated countless volumes to reason, wisdom, and virtue, while stupidity, that constant companion of our species, has been relegated to the margins of philosophical analysis. However, if we observe carefully the tapestry of human history, we will find that the threads of stupidity are woven more deeply and decisively than we have ever wanted to admit. Stupidity is not merely the absence of intelligence. It is an active force, with a will of its own, that has shaped empires and toppled civilizations. As Dietrich Bonhoeffer noted from his cell in Tegel prison, stupidity is a more dangerous enemy of the good than malice. Against malice one can protest, one can expose it, one can even prevent it by using force. Stupidity, however, cannot be attacked. Neither with protests nor with force can anything be done against it. Perhaps this explains why great thinkers, from Plato to Kant, preferred to focus their reflections on the light of reason rather than on the shadows of stupidity. It is more comforting to believe that human beings inevitably progress toward enlightenment than to admit that stupidity is an endemic condition of our nature, persistent throughout all ages and cultures. And yet, wasn't it the Athenians, cradle of Western philosophy, who condemned Socrates, the wisest among them, to death for the crime of asking uncomfortable questions? Wasn't it the same Rome that bequeathed us law and engineering that fell into the decadence of emperors who appointed their horses as consuls? History is replete with these moments when collective stupidity defeated the most elementary common sense. The fundamental paradox of stupidity is that, unlike other human limitations, it is rarely recognized by those who suffer from it. As Charles Darwin observed, ignorance more frequently begets confidence than does knowledge. This phenomenon, later dubbed the Dunning-Kruger effect by modern psychology, had already been intuited by Socrates when he affirmed that the principle of wisdom consisted in recognizing one's own ignorance. This blindness to one's own stupidity has had catastrophic consequences throughout history. Consider the medieval crusades, where the fervent stupidity of entire masses led to the slaughter of innocents in the name of a God who was supposed to be merciful. Or the Spanish Inquisition, when institutionalized stupidity led to the torture and execution of thousands under the pretext of purifying their souls. But stupidity does not only dwell in individual minds, it crystallizes in social structures and organizations, amplifying its devastating effects. Carlo Cipolla, in his masterful essay on human stupidity, proposed that always and inevitably, each of us underestimates the number of stupid individuals in circulation. And even more disquietingly, the probability that a person is stupid is independent of any other personal characteristic. This universality of stupidity explains why no revolution, no political system, no technological advancement has managed to eradicate it. The French Revolution, which proclaimed the triumph of reason, soon degenerated into the Jacobin Terror. The Russian Revolution, conceived to liberate the oppressed, gave way to Stalinist totalitarianism. In each case, stupidity found new ways to manifest itself, adapting like a virus, resistant to the antibodies of critical thinking. Friedrich Nietzsche perceived this persistence when he wrote, "In individuals, insanity is rare, but in groups, parties, nations, and epochs, it is the rule." And it is precisely this collective, institutionalized, and normalized stupidity that has defined some of the darkest moments of our species. The history of the First World War offers us perhaps the most overwhelming example of institutionalized collective stupidity. What began as an isolated incident, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, was transformed through a chain of stupid decisions into a global conflagration that devoured an entire European generation. As historian A.J.P. Taylor noted, it was a war into which men slid, or rather staggered and stumbled, after the events. The system of military alliances, supposedly designed to ensure peace through a balance of powers, became an automatic mechanism for the escalation of conflict. The mobilization plans, elaborated with meticulous precision by supposedly brilliant minds, were so rigid that once initiated, they could not be stopped. As philosopher Bertrand Russell observed, war does not determine who is right, only who is left. And yet, the soldiers marched cheerfully toward the trenches, convinced they would be home by Christmas, while their generals, anchored in 19th century tactics, sent them in waves against modern machine guns. This monumental military stupidity cost millions of lives and transformed the bucolic European fields into endless cemeteries. Stupidity, unlike evil, rarely recognizes its consequences. After the devastation of the First World War, the victors, in an act of diplomatic stupidity without precedent, imposed the Treaty of Versailles on Germany, thus sowing the seeds of resentment that Hitler would cultivate until the next catastrophe. As economist John Maynard Keynes prophesied in 1919, if we aim deliberately at the impoverishment of Central Europe, vengeance, I dare predict, will not limp. And it did not limp. The political stupidity of the 20s and 30s allowed the rise of totalitarianisms, while supposedly enlightened democracies practiced appeasement in the face of fascist aggression. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, after handing Czechoslovakia to Hitler in 1938, proclaimed to have secured peace for our time. Less than a year later, Europe was burning again. This historical sequence illustrates another fundamental characteristic of stupidity: its resistance to learning. As philosopher George Santayana observed in a phrase that has become cliché precisely because of its irrefutable truth, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. History is a cemetery of unlearned lessons, of errors reiterated with stubborn persistence. And what about the Cold War, that period when humanity lived under the constant threat of nuclear annihilation? Two superpowers, armed with arsenals capable of destroying the planet several times over, confronted each other in a zero-sum game where geopolitical stupidity reached apocalyptic dimensions. As Albert Einstein noted, I do not know with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. Bureaucratic stupidity has also played a fundamental role in historical development. The complexity of modern systems has created what Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil, that capacity of normal individuals to participate in atrocities when immersed in structures that dilute personal responsibility. Adolf Eichmann, the logistical architect of the Holocaust, described himself as a simple official following orders. The moral stupidity of this abdication of ethical judgment allowed the Nazi terror apparatus to function with industrial efficiency. And yet, it would be a mistake to conceive of stupidity solely as a phenomenon of masses or of privileged individuals with power. Democratic stupidity, That tendency of voters to act against their own interests has been a constant from ancient Athens to our modern republics. As H. L. Mencken noted with acidic irony, no one ever went broke underestimating the intelligence of the great American public. This electoral stupidity has deep roots in our tribal psychology. We prefer the comfortable certainty of our prejudices to the uncomfortable complexity of reality. As Aldous Huxley observed, facts do not cease to exist because they are ignored. Technology, far from immunizing us against stupidity, has amplified its reach and accelerated its propagation. Consider the invention of the printing press, that milestone that promised to democratize knowledge. While it allowed the dissemination of works like Diderot and D'Alembert's Encyclopédie, it also facilitated the mass circulation of anti-Semitic pamphlets, witch-hunting manuals, and war propaganda. Each technological advance that promised enlightenment brought with it new shadows of stupidity. The Internet, the latest frontier of this technological evolution, has created what we might call industrial-scale stupidity. Social networks have democratized not only information, but also disinformation, allowing conspiracy theories that were previously confined to the margins of society to reach global audiences in a matter of hours. As Umberto Eco noted shortly before his death, social media have given the right to speak to legions of idiots who previously spoke only in the bar after a glass of wine, without harming the community. But now, they have the same right to speak as a Nobel laureate. This democratization of stupidity has had profound political consequences. Contemporary philosopher Daniel Dennett warned that there is nothing more dangerous than a persuasive bad argument, and our digital age has perfected the art of manufacturing and disseminating such arguments. Post-truth, that subordination of objective facts to emotions and personal beliefs, is merely the latest avatar of a stupidity that constantly reinvents itself. The current climate crisis offers perhaps the most sobering example of collective stupidity in real time. Despite the overwhelming scientific consensus on the anthropogenic causes of global warming, we continue to debate the reality of the phenomenon, while the planetary temperature continues its inexorable rise. As writer Jonathan Franzen observed, to call it climate change denial is too generous. It's more like a form of collective stupidity. And yet, even in the face of this existential threat, our response has been fragmentary, timid, incoherent. Philosopher Gunther Anders coined the term Promethean gap to describe that abyss between our technological capacity to alter the world and our inability to understand the consequences of such alterations. This gap is, in essence, a manifestation of the systemic stupidity of our civilization. This dynamic invites us to ask, is stupidity an anthropological constant, or has it evolved over time? Historical evidence suggests that, while the specific manifestations of stupidity vary according to cultural and technological context, its fundamental structure remains unchanged. As psychologist Robert Sternberg observed, stupidity is not simply the absence of knowledge, but the lack of will or ability to use it. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of human stupidity is its tenacity in the face of education. The European Enlightenment, with its unshakable faith in the transformative power of reason, promised us that ignorance, and hence stupidity, would recede before the inexorable advance of knowledge. Condorcet, one of its most eloquent representatives, announced the indefinite progress of the human spirit, toward a future where reason would triumph over superstition and prejudice. 2 centuries later, that Enlightenment promise seems tragically naive. Universal literacy and unprecedented access to information have not eradicated stupidity. In many cases, they have simply sophisticatedly. As writer Martin Amis noted, people don't become smarter just because they've learned to read. History has shown that they can become significantly more stupid. This leads us to a disturbing conclusion. Perhaps stupidity is not an incidental condition, but constitutive of our species. German philosopher Max Horkheimer suggested that stupidity is a record of our human limits, a manifestation of our essential finitude, of our inability to completely transcend our biological, psychological, and cultural limitations. The tragic paradox of our condition is that we are intelligent enough to recognize our stupidity, but rarely wise enough to overcome it. We are trapped in what anthropologist Gregory Bateson would call a double bind. Our capacity for self-deception is inextricably intertwined with our capacity for self-awareness. This tension between consciousness and self-deception is clearly manifested in what we might call the stupidity of power. Throughout history, we see how individuals who reach positions of authority succumb to a peculiar form of blindness. Historian Lord Acton formulated it precisely. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But perhaps more pertinent is psychologist Philip Zimbardo's observation. Power not only corrupts, but blinds. This blindness, this stupidity induced by power, explains why so many empires, from the Roman to the Soviet, continued to implement self-destructive policies until their final collapse. The courtiers of Versailles, isolated in their bubble of privilege, while France sank into misery, exemplify this dynamic. As Queen Marie Antoinette reportedly said, though the quote is probably apocryphal, when informed that the people had no bread, "Let them eat cake." This response, whether historical or legendary, perfectly captures the aristocratic stupidity that precipitated the French Revolution. The history of colonialism offers us another eloquent example of this stupidity of power. European empires, convinced of their civilizational superiority, imposed their economic, political, and cultural systems on millennial societies, destroying in the process not only human lives, but also ancestral wisdom and alternative forms of knowledge. As Uruguayan writer Eduardo Galeano observed, colonization was a process of massive stupidity that ended up destroying what it claimed to improve. This imperial stupidity has left deep scars on the political geography of the contemporary world. The artificial borders drawn by European bureaucrats in Africa and the Middle East, ignoring ethnic, linguistic, and religious realities, continue to be a source of bloody conflicts. As historian Basil Davidson noted, colonialism not only stole Africa's resources, it also stole its future by imposing state structures completely alien to its social reality. And yet, decolonization has not been exempt from its own historical stupidity. Many revolutionary leaders, after overthrowing the colonial powers, replicated their same oppressive structures under new ideological banners. As Frantz Fanon bitterly observed, decolonization is always a violent phenomenon, but violence, if not critically and ethically digested, becomes a new form of colonization. This dialectic between oppression and liberation, between hegemonic and counter-hegemonic stupidity, invites us to rethink the relationship between power and knowledge, Michel Foucault argued that there is no neutral knowledge, that all knowledge is intertwined with power relations. But we could add that there is no neutral stupidity either. Each form of stupidity serves certain interests, privileges certain narratives, and silences others. Consider, for example, the historical persistence of patriarchy, that structure of male domination that has systematically marginalized the experience, knowledge, and contribution of women. Simone de Beauvoir characterized it as a form of collective bad faith, an institutionalized stupidity that impoverishes both oppressors and oppressed. As Virginia Woolf noted, for most of history, Anonymous was a woman. This systematic exclusion represents perhaps the most costly form of collective stupidity, the waste of half of human talent. Entire civilizations have deprived themselves of the intellectual, artistic, and scientific contributions of women, thus slowing their own development. As anthropologist Margaret Mead observed, every time we deny someone the opportunity to contribute fully to our civilization because of their sex, race, or any other arbitrary characteristic, we are impoverishing ourselves. A similar historical blindness has characterized our relationships with the natural world. The ecological stupidity of modernity, that illusion that we can extract infinitely from a finite planet, has led our civilization to the brink of environmental collapse. As ecologist Aldo Leopold noted, we test with the axe things we consider good, and with the plow things we consider sacred. We have a portrait and a mirror of the landscape, but we have no morality or aesthetics for the landscape. This ecological stupidity is deeply rooted in the Cartesian dichotomy between mind and matter, between humanity and nature. By conceiving of the natural world as a mere resource for human exploitation, we have destroyed the very systems that sustain our existence. As philosopher Bruno Latour observed, we have never been modern if by modernity we understand the clear separation between nature and culture. That separation was always a dangerous illusion. The 21st century, with its unprecedented challenges, from global pandemics to emerging artificial intelligences, forces us to confront our historical stupidity with renewed urgency. The speed of technological change has outpaced our ability to adapt ethically and philosophically, creating what sociologist Ulrich Beck called the risk society. As philosopher Hans Jonas warned, modern technological power